quality of life.
Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, the region's longest-running public affairs program. Legislative Report is a weekly review of activity at the state capitol featuring lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota. Most importantly, it's an opportunity for viewers to call or email their legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSE News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Well, with just over 1 week remaining in the 2015 legislative session, Minnesota lawmakers are working feverishly, at least the conference committees are, to finish up some important legislation. This will be our final show of the session and your opportunity to find out where local lawmakers stand on some key issues. Now, you can call the studio with your questions by dialing locally 218-788-2844 if you're in the Duluth Superior area, or our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. You can also email your questions to askmlr@wdse.org. Now let's introduce the legislators who are joining me in the WDSE studio. Starting to my immediate left, Representative Mary Murphy, Democrat from Hermantown. Welcome back, Representative Murphy.
Thank you very much.
And Representative Erik Simonson, a Democrat from Duluth, and welcome back, Representative
Thanks,
Simonson. Now, it's a little over a week to go till the session ends May 18th, which leaves just a handful of days to work out a lot of issues. And Representative Murphy, talking before the show, there is a lot left to get done to be finished by that deadline.
There is, and there's all the money questions that are still unknown to us. The conference committees have not been told what their targets are, what amount of money they have to spend for their subject area. And so that has not been made public at this time, and we expect that will happen tomorrow morning.
And who is responsible for that? Where do those target numbers come from?
The target numbers come from the majority party leadership.
So in the House, it would be the Republicans. On the Senate, it would be the Democrats. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then the differences would be worked out in a conference committee.
Yes, each conference committee would be told their total amount of money that they have to spend.
Okay.
And also if there's any other directions that come from on high, somehow or another, what the agreements were that were made out in the fishing boat, or if indeed that was the case, which I don't believe that was the case.
Well, there were a lot of smiling faces on the fishing boat because they caught a lot of fish.
That's what I understand.
If you're not sure what Representative Murphy's talking about, the House Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and the Governor all went fishing together on the fishing opener, and they had a pretty good day from all of them.
And the Lieutenant Governor was there too,
yes.
and although she wasn't in the same boat apparently.
Sounds like the two parties not really in the same boat so far this
Right.
session. Representative Simonson?
That's exactly right. This session has been 17 weeks long, and we were just talking before the show here that we're really no farther ahead than when we started 17 weeks ago. With 8 days to go, there isn't a single omnibus bill that's been passed yet by either body, so we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to try to accomplish passing a state budget by Monday night.
And Representative Simonson, one thing that we mentioned or talked about a little bit before the show is that a lot of the policy items have been agreed to in these committees, but it's the actual dollars that are still not agreed to.
Right, and honestly, there wasn't a lot of policy issues that were looked at this session. It really was a lot about finances. So, if we say that most of the policy issues are agreed to, that's likely true, but that's really a small percentage of the total things that we're looking at trying to accomplish in the last week here.
And Representative Murphy, in your experience, and you've got a lot of it at the legislature, with just 1 week to go and no targets set, is that unusual, or is this really late in your experience?
I've seen it both ways, and I've seen it this late before, and it's worked, and I've seen it this late before, and it hasn't worked. But for the most part, I'm still pretty sure that we will finish in a week's time. I'm pretty sure that the chairs of the committees, the House and Senate conference committees, have been talking just between themselves on what they can think out about what the spending that they will receive can be spent on and how much. I think each conference committee, though, has at least 5 items that needs real negotiations with, and where there's real differences, and that will be public discussion and testimony and so forth. Although last week, most of the conference committees did have the items that where the major differences were, public testimony on those major differences. I know in K-12 they did, they had, the day the Senate was, had the gavel, they took their 2 or 3 key items and had testimony. And then the next day the House was in charge, and they had their 3 major issued disputes, or that are in dispute, and had the people that were testifying in public about the needs for those programs. And so they're just waiting now to know how much money there is that could go for those programs.
Representative Simonson, it might be helpful for viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with the legislative, how the legislature works, especially as we get down to the wire here. Talk a little bit about the conference committees, how people are chosen for those committees, and the work that they do that really is so important to get bills passed at the end.
Right, so that's a good question. That's not always a very clear answer, but I will do my best. Typically when one body or the other passes a large omnibus bill off the floor, for example, the tax bill passes off the House floor, and the Senate passes their version of a tax bill. And those bills, typically don't line up in terms of being exactly the same. So each body will appoint a certain amount of members to what's called a conference committee. Anywhere between 3 or 5 generally will come together.
Is that total from each?
From each side.
From each side.
Right, and it'll be representative of the majority party. So the House majority will be Republicans, sometimes all Republicans on the conference committee. And that group will come together and meet just like a typical committee, where they'll take testimony and they'll try to go through the bills kind of line by line and line up the pieces that are the same, and that's fairly easy to agree to. And then the pieces that aren't necessarily the same, if there's dollars involved, well, that falls back to the target issue that Representative Murphy was talking about. But essentially their goal is to come up with a bill that is exactly spot on, and then that goes back to each respective body for approval, and neither body can amend it then. It has to be either voted up or voted down.
So once it comes out of conference, it's either strictly a vote. You aren't going to see any debate over amendments on the floor of the House or Senate at that point.
Correct. There'll be a fair amount of discussion, but there won't be any amendments.
And for something to pass in the conference committee, you need to put it in to the appropriation in, and it has to have 3 votes on either side, on both sides.
Of the conference committee members.
That's correct.
One thing that's interesting, and I've seen it play out before, Representative Murphy, is that in order to be on the conference committee, you actually have to have voted in favor of the bill. And sometimes I've heard of people voting in favor of a bill that they don't agree with just so that they have an opportunity to be on the conference committee. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, about how
that's correct, and that depends on the speaker sometimes. Sometimes the speaker has, I know the last speaker did appoint people, even if they had, to the conference committee, even if they hadn't voted for the bill, if they were perhaps the lead or whatever. But this speaker is not. This speaker is appointing only people that vote yes on the bill.
And so sometimes it can be strategic, Representative Simonson, even if you don't agree with the bill, if you want to have a seat in the negotiating committee, that you vote for the bill.
Right, and that just happened with the House tax bill, actually, where we had the DFL lead vote in support of the bill, even though the rest of us did not, in order to secure a spot on the conference committee. So at least that the minority voice is represented at that table.
Well, since we're talking taxes and you sit on the House Tax Committee, there are really some big differences in the omnibus tax bills between the House and the Senate. And I don't believe you're on the conference committee, but can you talk a little bit about those differences and what's likely to happen in your mind?
Right, so the biggest differences, I think, were just in the targets that were given to the respective bodies. The House Tax Committee was given a spending target of around $2 billion, and that's $2 billion in tax cuts in a time that we have nearly a $2 billion surplus. The Senate has a much more conservative target. I want to say somewhere in the $300 to $400 million range, which generally focuses on tax relief, property tax relief, and things like that, programs that generally work really well for middle class. So those two bills are extremely different in what they contain. You know, the House bill has $2 billion worth of tax cuts, most of which is geared towards commercial and industrial property tax base. And cuts to local government aid and things like that. And the Senate bill is almost completely opposite. Where it bolsters programs that we think that work good for Minnesotans. So they have a large discrepancy. So it'll be curious to see what comes out of this target discussion, hopefully tomorrow.
All right, so it sounds like we're going to learn a lot starting as soon as tomorrow.
That's a maybe.
Maybe when we get back into session. So today is Mother's Day, and I want to say Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there, and the lawmakers actually have a rare couple of days off, at least some do. We spoke earlier in the show about the House Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and the Governor all going fishing together. A lot of smiles on that boat, but do you think much policy happens on something like that, Representative Murphy, or is it more a photo opportunity than policy discussions?
Well, I think it's more of a social, a business opportunity to show that people are not enemies and that people work together and play together, that kind of thing, and that we're looking for in the fishing opener, it's a explanation of we're working together and that tourism was one of our major economic drivers in the state, and we want to do everything we can to show our wonderful parks out and so forth. And they picked Vermilion this year because that was the grand opening of the new Towers Sudan Vermilion Park, and, along with that great lake that's up there and the great fishing that traditionally for hundreds of years has been a resource that the people have not only used for recreation but for their livelihood. And so bringing people and bringing the media to that area just shows that they're showcasing this new aspect of that northeastern Minnesota resource. And they're doing it together, and people will follow all year long. Well, if it was good enough for the governor and the majority leader, why not? Why don't we go up there for the weekend? Or why don't we go up there in the middle of the week? Maybe a Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday when there aren't so many people around, and that kind of thing.
And as Representative Murphy mentioned, Representative Simonson, how important recreation is to the state, and with Lake Vermilion being one of the premier lakes, it can't hurt at all to get outside of the metro area for some of the lawmakers from the metro and see what else Minnesota has to offer.
You know, that's very true. It's incredible the amount of folks from the metro area that just haven't really been north of Pine City. You know, maybe once or twice in their life. So I think any opportunity to get out of the metro area, like you say, and just get out and see what's in greater Minnesota certainly helps them appreciate more about what is greater Minnesota and the fact that it is a big part of our state.
All right, I want to remind folks that this is Minnesota Legislative Report. Your last chance this session to ask questions of the lawmakers, so call in those questions now. We've got plenty of time with two great lawmakers to answer those questions. And Representative Murphy, one thing that happened this week that's kind of been simmering for years, and that were a group of family law bills that deal with things like child custody, divorce, passed both through the House and the Senate this week. Talk a little bit about some of those bills, maybe at least in general, and why this is such an area, difficult area for lawmakers to deal with.
Well, it's difficult because so many lawmakers have had personal experiences, either through their jobs or through their family experiences and knowing somebody that's been in the situation. And they start out with, this is what happened to me kind of thing.
Sure.
And up to this point, there has been especially on custody disputes, that kind of thing, there has been rigid sides and not very much consensus building. And even with Representative Smith, who hasn't been at the legislature for a couple of years now, or for 2 terms now, but even up to the point where he worked so many years and developed a bill that seemed to be working. There still were rigid sides and different positions of different kinds of lawyers, and then the family part that came in. And for the first time ever, they've been working 2 years with all the players in a room at the same time and not giving up. And they reached consensus. And the bills that have passed this year are the bills that had consensus items in it. And it's taken the base that was laid before and built upon that. And so there's hardly any issue left hanging out there that's a really bitterness is being shown, and all sides from the family, the children from the family side, the spouse's side, the ex's side, the children's side. There's good, positive decisions that have been made to go forward into the future without causing great financial harm or physical harm to anybody. And it hasn't been done before. And the people that have worked on this should be applauded and congratulated, and we should go forward and not mess with it for a while until we find out really what has to be worked on again a little bit more. But it seems like they've dotted their I's and crossed their T's and put a period on it.
And is there some specifics maybe that people might be interested in? Representative Simonson, can you speak to any specifics, like what some of these new law changes are?
You know, I don't know a lot about what's in the content of those bills, but I will say this: I think it speaks pretty well to the process. Anytime that you've got an issue that's somewhat controversial or significantly controversial, it takes a lot of time to get people on board. And I think this is just a really good example of something that a number of people felt very strongly about and did their homework, and were able to reach this consensus that Representative Murphy's talking about. And that took a course of several years, kind of building this base. And I think that's laws don't happen overnight, especially ones that have personal impacts on people. And couple that with the amount of attorneys that we have in the legislature, it makes things difficult to get things done. But
2 non-attorneys here, by the way. So, Representative Simonson, one of the things that's going to be happening soon, the bill was actually passed last year, but will be going into effect July 1st. That's Minnesota's new medical marijuana bill. There's been a lot of talk about it. There's been some media coverage of it. Are we ready? What do you think? What's your opinion?
Well, that's another one of those issues that was really difficult. And I think if you remember back to when that was passed, that bill started out as something that looked a lot like an apple and ended up something that looked very much like an orange. And that was an example of a number of parties that had significant concerns, and from all sides really. But eventually we passed a bill, and that's going to go into effect here. And I think the key is for all parties to just kind of see how this goes for a while, and see what the impact is, and kind of take stock in how things come together, and if it works or doesn't work. And I'm sure that we're going to have to revisit it at some point in time and make some adjustments. But ultimately we're just going to have to give it a little time and see how it comes together.
Now, there are two companies in Minnesota that are going to be providing medical marijuana, and there are going to be some dispensaries around the state. I don't believe one in Duluth yet, although the city council is starting to talk about that.
Right.
How will that work? People will have to have a prescription from their doctor, and then they go, it's just like going to a pharmacy to get a medicine?
Right, except for the pharmacy may be, a couple hours drive. That's has to do with where the dispensaries are located, but that's essentially exactly what will happen.
Okay.
Each congressional district
Okay.
has something.
And there's 8 congressional districts.
That's correct. And the people that have their prescriptions will have to have cash,
Okay.
and they will have to pay in cash because banks don't do business with this type of pharmacy.
Because this is still in violation of federal law, is
That's
that correct?
correct.
So that's a concern for the banks. Well, speaking of banks, this week credit unions got a bill passed that they've been asking for. It's something called a Prize Link Savings Bill. Representative Murphy, do you know much about that? It's another option for credit union customers.
Yes, but I don't know the details of it.
Okay. One thing that's really been hampering the legislature this year is the debate over MNsure and Minnesota Care. And we don't have Representative Schultz here today, who's kind of an expert in the area, but Representative Simonson, maybe we can talk a little bit about what's happening there. There's a movement to end Minnesota Care completely, and I know the Democrats are against that. I saw some figures from the governor's office about how many people would be affected. I think there's over 3,500 in St. Louis County alone would get kicked off of Minnesota Care.
Right, so this is one of those issues that's currently in front of a conference committee with the Health and Human Services bill. And in the House version, the GOP House version of the bill essentially eliminates Minnesota Care in its entirety. And statewide, there's about 100,000 folks that are on Minnesota Care. And I think the number is 3,500 in St. Louis County, if I'm not mistaken. But 100,000 people that are currently on Minnesota Care, and this program's been in effect for 20 years, and there's a lot of data that just really supports, I think, the effectiveness of it. But their plan is to eliminate this Minnesota Care program and have these folks, essentially go to the exchange through MNsure and obtain their own insurance, which is really going to be, A, it's going to be very difficult for them. B, it's going to essentially make it unaffordable for them because Minnesota Care is really designed for the lowest of the lowest incomes, and it's going to be unfortunate. But the Senate version, and the Senate side, Senator Lori is adamant that Minnesota Care shouldn't be dismantled just yet. There is an issue with the provider tax that I think expires in 2018 or 2019. So we all realize that something has to be done between now and then in terms of figuring out what we're going to do with this program, if we're going to fund it again, if we're going to move to something different. There is a task force in the works that has already made some recommendations, and I just saw on Friday, I think, that all of the providers that pay this tax that essentially funds Minnesota Care, have now written to the legislature and said now is not the time to dismantle Minnesota Care. So that issue still remains to be resolved in the conference committee. But I think with the governor and the Senate and the positions that they have, that I think we can all recognize that we need to do something soon, but right now to just end it is not the best answer.
And it's likely that if that were in the bill, the governor would veto that portion of the bill, or maybe the whole bill.
One would assume.
Representative Murphy, we've got a call from Jim in Hibbing. Jim is wondering, will the legislature ever ban cell phone use while driving? We don't have anybody here from Transportation Committee today, but I'm sure this is an issue of concern for many lawmakers. So.
I think ever, yes. I think when there's more cases of misuse of the cell phone while driving, in accident reports, that it may come up. I'm sure no one uses a cell phone while they're driving unless it is emergency, or unless it's not dangerous to them. But just saying it, a law, it's common sense that you don't use your cell phone while you're driving. Mm-hmm. It seems to me. But if we do, and there is still misuse, and there will be a fine or something like that. Is that a detriment to having people not use their cell phones? I'm not sure that that's a good thing. But right now it hasn't been on up for discussion in recent weeks, I don't believe.
If I remember right, I think Representative Yaros was one of the proponents of this bill before he retired. And Representative Simonson, there's been a big effort, especially by local schools, to talk about no texting and driving, which has been a big issue. And I've seen documented several accidents in the state occurred because of people texting while driving. It does seem like a no-brainer, but yet we see people on their cell phones every day on the road. So it seems like something that maybe at some point the legislature might have to get involved in.
I think there is a time in the future where that discussion is, discussion happens, it seems, every year. 2 years ago, I sat on the Transportation Committee and we talked about this. And what's interesting is, you have to define what using a cell phone means. Right. You buy a cell phone now and it's got a mapping feature on it, and a lot of people use it for, navigation in their car, and they're looking at the map and, is that okay or is that not okay? And in most new cars that you buy nowadays, you can program your phone to work through your audio system. So is that using your cell phone, or
so you're not?
So it's hands-free essentially, right? Yep. But that's still a distraction too from driving. So it's an interesting discussion, but I don't think that the legislature is quite there in terms of a total ban just yet. But I do think we all agree that texting is not a good idea.
Well, the State Patrol will tell you that you shouldn't even have your radio on when you're driving. Your complete attention should be on the road. But of course, we know in practical use that doesn't happen that often. We have a call from Jeff in Duluth and Representative Simonson. Jeff's wondering about the proposed light rail. I don't know if light rail is the right term, but the progress on service extension from the Twin Cities suburbs to Duluth. People ask those questions. I haven't seen much movement this year on that issue.
I think that's mainly in the federal hands right now. I think a lot of work has been done. A lot of progress has been made. The plan is there. I think the intent is there. The will is there in many cases, but I think that most of the funding is tied up with the feds right now.
All right. Representative Murphy, this question from a caller. He was a Minnesota teacher. With your teaching background, I'm hoping this might work for you. He says that he taught in Wisconsin for 5 years, and then he's been teaching in Minnesota for 20 plus years. He was told by both Wisconsin and Minnesota Federation of Teachers that there is no longer retirement reciprocity between the two states. So his question is, do you remember retirement reciprocity, and what would need to happen to reinstate it? And I think he's talking about years of service, I would assume, being counted towards either state's retirement, teacher's retirement.
I don't know about the reciprocity, but I do know that in most cases, if he's still teaching in Minnesota and he's looking for the 5 years that he taught in Wisconsin to count, he could buy that back. And he should contact the TRA about that.
Okay.
If he's TRA.
Right, and it doesn't say he is or isn't, so I can't answer.
I bet, I almost bet he is, and he should contact the Teachers Retirement Association about buying it back. But you can't just, he could buy those 5 years possibly, and with the interest. He would have to pay the interest that and the actuarial amount, but it can be done.
Okay, and so it sounds like further research might be necessary for that caller, who didn't leave a name, so I can't tell you where he was calling from. Well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, Greg Grell. We're joined by Representative Mary Murphy, Representative Erik Simonson. We've got about a half an hour left for you to get your calls in and be answered here on the air, so call now if you've got questions for our lawmakers. They're going to have a busy week coming up with just 1 week left in the session. So Representative Simonson, at this point of the session, while you're waiting for conference committees, there is still some other committee work being done, and sometimes work being done on laws that maybe won't be passed this year, but could be passed in future years. So it's not as if you're just sitting around, right, during this last week waiting for the conference committees to come back?
Right. It's still fairly busy, and there is, when we have people available, there are still some committees doing some work. A lot of it is informational hearings, like you say, just preparing for a future year or future session. But there is still some of that happening, and every day we have a regular session where we're still passing a lot of non-controversial bills and things like that. But most of the work is within the conference committees this week.
And I think I've seen so far most of the bills passed by the legislature that the governor have signed have all been virtually unanimous votes. So not too many controversial issues have come before the House yet to this point, Representative Murphy?
Not yet, because they're still in conference committee. Even the smaller conference committee, the 3-member on each side, conference committees are busy with their negotiations that are taking place, and some of them have money issues in them too, and so they can't settle them until we know how much money is available. There is one bill out there that I've received some email about and some phone calls about, and that's a bill that's still being talked about, and the author, Representative Crenshaw, is still trying to change, negotiate with some people on, and that is it's a communication bill, and it has to do with landlines.
Okay.
And he maintains that there's too much, the Attorney General is opposed, the AARP is opposed, and several other groups are opposed to it. He says there's a lot of misinformation out there about that, and that there's still a possibility that it could be. However, it was supposed to be on the floor on Thursday, and it was not. And so he's progressing it. It's on the calendar, and he is still progressing it because it is very controversial, and he doesn't have the answers. And the people that are saying that the only phone kind of communication they have is their landline don't want to put that in dispute. It's deregulation of phone companies to a greater degree than they already are. And we know that every kind of major deregulation that's taken place, from the airlines down to the phone companies, the big phone companies, Ma Bell, remember that, those years, it hasn't helped the local consumer a whole lot. And we all ended up paying more and having poorer service, in my mind. And so I'm not anxious for this bill to come up for a final vote. And I don't think, I know if, as of Thursday, if it had come up for a final vote, it wouldn't have passed. And so it's best that it's being progressed.
And Representative Simonson, Representative Murphy brings up a good point about deregulation, is that it seems to work best in large metro areas where there is competition. You might have a number of phone companies working to get your business so that there is some competition. But in rural areas, that really doesn't happen. And so that's maybe where the legislature does have a role, I would think.
You know, you're exactly right. And if you want to compare it to something that's real and talked about a lot today, is just look at where broadband is today. And in the metro area, or even here in Duluth, you know, we're pretty spoiled here because we have really good service, and there's competition, and that's why we have good service. But as you get out into greater Minnesota, more in the rural areas, you know, that service isn't necessarily there, and there's not enough demand for it to, you know, incentivize these companies to put the service in. So there's no regulation for broadband in the state of Minnesota, so that's why there's no real push to get it done. And I'm afraid that if we deregulate the telephone industry, that's essentially what we end up with as well, is that we'll have really good service in populated areas, but the less populated areas will receive less and less service as time goes on, unless, of course, you want to pay a lot of money for it. But I think that's a good, you know, way to look at it, as terms of what could happen, is just look at where broadband is today, because there's no regulation.
And it's not that far, it's not that rural. I talked to Representative Simonson earlier in the week about an email that I'd received from somebody on the Morris Thomas Road, from a constituent on the Morris Thomas Road. And I said, is this got to do with your broadband stuff? And he said, yes, it is. And it's just, it's a rural part of Hermantown, which is
Not too far from Duluth,
not too far, but only this far.
on the map.
Only this far, you know, and they don't have good internet service on that road. And so, and that kind of thing with phones leads us to tell the consumer, well, there's always a PUC there that will regulate the phones. But how does the ordinary person with the less resource of active newspaper reporting these days, and it's not a real earnest thing that the investigative reporters on our local TV stations are following. How does the ordinary person know the schedule of the Public Utilities Commission in St. Paul on a regular basis? And when will they be talking about regulation of landlines? And they're the ones that would ultimately make the decisions about the landlines if we do deregulation of them. And so we're taking the openness away from, and the transparency away from the consumer that is going to be ending up having to pay a larger price. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. When they're used to getting their bill on a regular basis and it's a certain amount, and they're living on fixed incomes and they don't want it to go up. And so not knowing and not having the broadband, not knowing where the internet is going and who's delivering the internet kind of thing, and now the phone service that they have always relied on. It's taken away, and they say, well, the majority. But the minority always has to be protected too. And we just don't have good answers at this time. And so we can't move too fast. And we shouldn't be.
Well, Representative Murphy, one thing that I've read this week, some reporting about how there are a lot of rural lawmakers who are fairly unhappy with what legislation has been moving during this session because they feel like there's been an imbalance and that rural Minnesota isn't being taken care of the same way metro Minnesota is. And maybe that goes beyond just the broadband and the landlines. Are there some other areas like that you've seen some disagreement between the rural and the metro area? Greater Minnesota, as they call it?
Well, there is in every issue. There's a little bit, there's something in every issue. In education, in higher education, but it depends on your perspective of what's rural and what's metro too. And we even have debates with a Northwestern representative that doesn't think Duluth area is part of rural Minnesota. So it depends on the issue and it depends on the conversation. But we have them.
It's another thing to watch and just see how it plays out over time. Representative Simonson, this week another oil train derailed and there was a big fire in North Dakota, and it kind of points out the fact that Minnesota hasn't been able to agree yet, or the legislature hasn't been able to agree yet on new regulations for oil trains and just train safety in general. That's kind of getting to be a big issue with how many oil trains are passing through Minnesota. You're not on transportation anymore, but I'm sure you have an opinion about this. Is there some changes that the state needs to make to try to make our towns safer that have rail lines nearby?
Right. I think, the governor has a really good initiative of how to try to accomplish this. And I think the really big need that Minnesota is looking at is just making rail crossings safer, which doesn't necessarily address the derailing of trains issue, but it does bring into perspective how really how much work and money we need to invest in our rail crossings. Because frankly, there's too many of them that are not safe, they're not well marked, and we're continuing to see problems. So the question is, how do we pay for that? And I think the governor has a good initiative in how we do that by assessing essentially the railroad companies. At this point, the House Republicans haven't been supportive of that. Because they're just saying it's really, an unnecessary new tax on the railroad companies. But the reality is that these things are continuing to happen. We're seeing increased rail traffic because of the Bakken oil coming out of North Dakota. It's traveling through western Minnesota and down to the southern part of the country, which increases rail traffic on just about every track in Minnesota. So I think that the big issue that we need to resolve as lawmakers is how do we upgrade these railroad crossings to make them safer for the general public.
Now, since this this issue crosses state lines, do you think there's more need for the federal government to be stepping in here, maybe even providing funding or some direction on how to make it just safer in general for the country?
In an ideal situation, yes, but to sit back and wait for the federal government to do something, I think is really irresponsible on our part, because, we've seen waiting for the federal government before, and it's just not realistic that it's going to happen anytime soon. But this was a case where we could have done something now and really started to work on some of these crossings this year and get something done.
Representative Murphy, is this an issue that you hear things about from your constituents? Is there concern out there?
Oh yes, there is concern out there, and we see it in letters to the editor even. There was something about this week, a letter on Park Point, of losing access on Park Point for the boat waiting for a sailboat, or the bridge waiting for the sailboat to go through, when there was an ambulance with lights running. Mm-hmm. And this person was upset about that. And we have the same thing. Like you said, my constituents, I see it when I go down Midway Road and I get stopped by the train at Adolph, and then a mile further I get stopped by the other train going, and thinking, gosh, I hope ambulance doesn't have to come up or go down Midway Road at this time. And I think of it every time I go past those crossings. And we were very fortunate, and that's what led to the governor's proposal, is that he had that roundtable here in last June or July at UMD, where the people that transport things on the railroad, transport the materials on the railroad, the ore, and the steel companies were there, and the room was full of people that were offering their advice on what was needed and what had to be done to make it better. And that's the governor is proposing, that the railroads take some more responsibility. And of course they don't want to do, because that hurts the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, Representative Murphy, we had a caller who wanted to know what you think about fast-tracking teacher certification and licensure because of the teacher shortage. Would you think fast-tracking teacher licensing would be one solution to the teacher shortage?
Depends on what we mean by fast-tracking. And right now we are listening to the problems, and we haven't come up with solutions yet, but in this interim, the legislative auditor is going to be doing a report on the Board of Teaching, who issues the licensures, and the difference between the Department of Education and their recommendations for licensures. And we are trying to anticipate the problems of teacher shortages in the future. But we also we've had 2 years now where we've looked at recommendations for teaching, or for issuing out-of-state licensures. And there's some talk about the reluctance of the Board of Teaching in doing that. And if teachers' certifications from other states automatically should be recognized in Minnesota, even though the teacher training expectations or educational credits aren't the same. We're in about the second year of discussion on this, and the solutions are not quite there yet. But we haven't peaked at the teacher shortage thing yet, but we know that 5 years from now there is going to be a shortage. And so we do have to address it, and we're starting to do that. But I think the legislative auditor's report will at least tell us if we're funding the Board of Teaching and the licensure division of the Department of Education, if we're funding them responsibly at this time. We'll know that for sure. The other things will fall into place after we know that.
All right. Well, we are winding down here on Minnesota Legislative Report. Just a few minutes left to get your questions in, so call now if you do have questions. Representative Simonson, you serve on the Job Growth and Energy Affordability Policy and Finance Committee, and one thing that we haven't talked a lot about this show especially, but this session, is what is going on in the energy area, and if there is some policy going on that viewers might be interested in.
There's a lot happening, actually, and it's not necessarily all good, I think. The House version of the energy bill, the jobs bill portion of it is, there's not a lot in there. There wasn't a lot of money to spend for our committee, so there's nothing really new and exciting in there. But the energy policy, I think, is very concerning to a lot of Minnesotans because it kind of rolls back our renewable energy standard and makes a shift, not necessarily taking wind energy and solar energy out of the picture, but it's essentially saying that rather than force a mandate of renewable energies that only include wind and solar, they want to include large hydro as one of the renewable energy sources. And the only large hydro that's available anywhere near us is a plant that's being built in Manitoba. So this would be energy that would come from Canada, and essentially what we think that this policy does is it really stymies the new and growing wind energy industry here in Minnesota, which is growing by leaps and bounds. So there's a lot of energy policy buried in this omnibus bill that I think at the end of the day doesn't become law. Because it's just such a step in the wrong direction, we think, for Minnesota. But if it were to pass, it would be a significant change all across Minnesota, just in terms of our renewables and going forward.
All right. You know, earlier this year, Indiana's governor got in some hot water when the state allowed a bill that wouldn't serve gay couples. And this week in the Senate, I don't know if the House has heard a bill, but there was a senator that introduced a bill that would allow business owners with strong opposition to same-sex marriage not to have to cater to those ceremonies. Now, the bill isn't going to go anywhere this session, but it might in the future. Just thought maybe I'd throw out that issue. Going down the right or wrong road on that one, Representative Simonson, if you're aware of it at all.
Well, yeah, I am aware of it, and I think it's, this is just me personally. We've not had any discussions anywhere about this, so this would be purely a personal opinion. But I think it's unfortunate that he had to do that, and I think it's the wrong direction. I think the legislature in Minnesota has had this conversation over the last couple of years, and I think we're in a good place right now. And I think to introduce something like this, knowing full well that it's not going to go anywhere, causes a lot of unnecessary consternation, and I'm, frankly, a little bit disappointed.
Okay. Representative Murphy, do you have any comment on that one at all, or it hasn't come before the House yet? But
that's correct, and the senator said it was for discussion purposes. Well, people will be discussing it, I'm sure, and maybe in the interim we will hear more about it, but. It's not something before the House of Representatives, and it doesn't need to be.
All right. We have a call from our friend Larry in Hermantown, and Larry says, Representative Simonson, that 2 county commissioners told him that it would be possible for the legislature to exempt senior citizens from paying property taxes. Would you be in favor of that, and would you be in favor of supplementing or replacing property taxes with a sales tax?
Oh, 2 good questions there. Sales tax is an interesting concept. If we were to go down the sales tax route, and try to eliminate local property taxes, that would be a worthy discussion that we should really have, because I think that's a far more progressive tax. But that being said, could the legislature exempt senior citizens from
Paying property tax.
paying local property taxes? Yeah, I suppose that we could. I don't think that that would be responsible of us to do that, because that really ties the hands of local governments. That's how they generate revenues to run the services that they need to run.
It's interesting that county commissioners would tell them that, because they would be the ones losing at least some of that money.
Right, and perhaps there's more to the backstory there, but I think that the answer is sure we could do just about anything we wanted to do, but I think it would be extremely irresponsible of us, and we would see a lot of pushback, I think, from local governments.
And Representative Murphy, Larry was wondering what your opinion was on that issue as well.
Well, I don't think that the legislature should take away the local government's ability to have property taxes, because otherwise, how does the city get paid, or how does the county get paid, or how does the school district get paid if they are building a new school? But the legislature can talk about incentives for property tax relief for senior citizens. And that's something that is in the current House proposal. Of course, they had $2 billion, so they could do that, is to reduce the property taxes for senior citizens. Some senior citizens need freezes or less property taxes, but not all do. And so that's where the discussion usually starts on whether they should freeze or not freeze. But if we have the finances available, if the state does, to provide this property tax relief, I think it's a good idea. But I think the best idea is to keep the homestead credit and have in the past we've had rebates to property taxes for people in need and rentals, and that seems to have worked, and I am strongly in favor of that. And it becomes more of a topic this week, because property taxes are due this week on May 15th. So, in fact, I'm going home and I'm going to write out my check and get it in the mailbox tomorrow morning. And so I understand the issues of people on fixed incomes, and that the legislature has a role to play. But just blanket doing it, and sometimes we've done it and it hasn't worked. But I wouldn't be opposed to having it come out of the legislature this year to have property tax relief from the state surplus, and it be in the tax bill.
Representative Simonson?
And I think that's one of the differences. If you look at the Senate tax bill versus the House tax bill, I think their property tax relief is really directed towards middle class and folks of lesser incomes that would directly impact folks like that. And the other piece that's in the House bill too, and I think Representative Murphy references too, is essentially a stepping down of the income tax paid on Social Security recipients and veterans as well. But so we'll see where that goes. That falls into this whole target discussion as well.
All right, and we are almost out of time. We just have a few minutes left, but before we wrap up here, anticipating a pretty long hours this week with all of the work that still has to be done to adjourn by the constitutional deadline, which is May 18th, I believe, Representative Murphy?
Yes, I'm anticipating a lot of, we'll go into session every day at least at 10 o'clock, and then probably having a recess so that the caucuses can meet, and then we'll go back into session to pass bills on the calendar, and for the Rules Committee to meet, so to address new issues that can be placed on the calendar. And then we will have floor session for a few minutes or hours, and then have other recesses, and then being called back at the call of the chair, which could take place anytime between, say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 12 o'clock at night. So it's not as steady, it's not as, you can't count on a certain time period as much. And the recesses serve for conference committees to meet, caucuses to meet, discussions to take place, negotiations to take place, or just hang around and wait for the call of the chair. And that will happen every single day. And I anticipate it'll happen Saturday and possibly Sunday too, and so we can finish on Monday.
All right, we only have about 30 seconds, but Lance from Hermantown sent in an interesting, what I would call a civics question. I'm going to throw it out there, but I'm not sure. I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but he's wondering, on the state seal, what language is the state motto in and what does it mean? Is that something that legislators have to know? Is that something that you're taught, Representative Murphy?
It's French. It's Star of the North.
Star of the North.
L'Étoile
du Nord.
Du Nord, yeah.
Pretty good, pretty good. Well, thank you both, Representative Simonson, Representative Murphy. Thanks to the lawmakers who are here today and those who have joined us all throughout the session, and to our viewers who called or emailed in their questions today. Very informative afternoon. And thank you for tuning in for the final edition of Minnesota Legislative Report for the 2015 session. One personal note to our good friend and longtime production crew member, Christy Filippini, who's going to be moving on to another chapter in her life. Thanks, Christy, for all the work you've done here. For the crew here at WDSE, WRPT, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.